Lee, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. Dead serious. I would love for you to give yourself, a quick little intro before we dive into with a few specific questions.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me. I don't know. I don't know where to start with me because I started paying attention to this stuff when I was just a kid. So, but really the last about 18, 19 years, this is what I've worked on specifically. This is my unpaid retirement job that I started before anybody else would have retired. And it came from a crossroads of hospice involvement as a volunteer, as a stand in hospice chaplain person, and a whole life of paying attention to conservation. So it all just kind of met up with natural burial. And then from there, moved on to home funeral interest. And from there, we moved into doula work and beyond. And in the mix of all that, I was always very interested in working with consumer advocacy around funerals. So it's all a great big constellation of different areas that need to be paid attention to. And so everybody was saying to me, geez, you got a finger in every pot. What do you call yourself? Well, give me one title. Every time I'm interviewed, they want to know what's your title. And I came up with this funeral reform advocate just because I couldn't think of anything else that was going to sort of cover all the bases. And that seems to become the sort of intro piece for me is that I don't just stay in, I don't believe that we can keep this in silos and make any of these movements successful unless we start cross referencing and cross training and understanding where we are in
Absolutely.
all of our efforts. Yeah.
If I were to describe you from my notes, from getting to know you, is I would say Lee Webster is a funeral reform OG, right? You pioneered and really formed a path for this industry, helping build the infrastructure for not only consumer rights, but also for death doulas, which is such a new term for the public, but really it's not that new. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the history of death doula. How did you stumble upon this particular vocation? Because you also co-founded NELA, which is National End of Life Doula Alliance, which we'll get into that a little bit. But love to hear just your perspective. What is a death doula, and how did you come across from this, and the evolution of this?
Yeah, I think it's pretty complicated actually, and there are some caveats that really need to be included in the conversation. But I would start by telling you that when I was 19, I had my first experience with being a doula, even though I didn't know that's what it was. I was taking some time off between semesters in college, and my roommate's grandmother and aunt were both at the end, and the family wanted to keep them living independently. So I moved into their little house in Vermont and cared for them until one left with a stroke and the other left with a heart attack. But what really informed that experience was that when I went to the hospital to visit the heart attack one, the family was there, and she waved the family away and asked me to come closer. And she said to me, "I think I'm dying." And instead of saying all the things that everybody else had been saying, you're going to be fine, buck up, everything's going to be fine, you're going to get better, you'll come back from this. I said, "Yeah, that's probably true. What are we going to do
Mm,
about that?" And then we had a conversation, and that was the last time I saw her. But it stuck with me. And it stuck with me my whole life because I seem to keep on in hospice situations. I seem to keep on having those experiences. It happened again with my mother-in-law, where everyone was trying to keep her quiet and keep her eating and
mm.
doing all the things. And I walked in one day and she looked at me and she said, "I'm dying and they won't let me go." And I said, "Okay, what are we
Oh,
going to do about
wow.
that?"
Wow.
So I have to say, I think that doula work is more of it's a less formal thing than it has become. I think people have been doing caregiving that moves into doula work and then moves into planning from there if you handle it well. If you don't give them those pat answers that
Wow. I just want to stay on that. I thought that story
yeah.
was so powerful because obviously there are a few patterns, right? And I think one thing that says a lot about you is one, you're realistic, right? And oftentimes families certainly want to keep their loved ones for as long as possible, but almost, I don't want to use the word selfish reasons, but it's just that, for the living is when the dying sort of not their own legacy and wishes perhaps are secondary, but very thin line. So doula sort of feels like, okay, how do I honor your wishes? And then at the same time, coordinate the families. How would you describe that just from all of your own experiences around that? Is that true?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and I think where I would go with that is to say that that people who take up this kind of work have to be realistic but not blunt, and they need to understand that the job is with the dying, but it primarily is with the people that are there to support who just don't have the vocabulary to be able to do it.
I
They've
see.
never been given permission to stand in front of a dead person and say, "Yes, you are dying. Here's how we're going to work together to make
Or
that."
comfortable to admit to the
Mm.
person who is
All of
dying.
that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's such a complex, emotional, and vulnerable position, and yeah. How would you guide families through situations like that? Would you say that's kind of the most common that shows up?
I think there are an awful lot of different ways that it shows up, and I would expect other people to be able to speak to that better than I do. I turned away from doing this as a continuous thing. I went on and had my career also in marketing and PR and all that type of thing. And when I came back to this work, I came through the lens of empowering people to do any aspect of the before death and after death experience. But that started with home funerals. And I think maybe that's a place we need to talk about in order
Mm,
to inform people about the doula space. Because even though as I say, and everybody I know who's ever been a caregiver has been doing doula work all along, but it wasn't called that. But when we started it about 25, 30 years ago now, with these with a greater awareness of what we could do as family members and as friends of families who've lost someone, and how we can empower those people and give them agency over the process after
mm,
that's where this really started. It certainly is where it started for me. So that's why we started the National Home Funeral Alliance, and that was to get very clear on the law about what's allowed and what isn't. And we came up against a really hard stop. The hard stop is that there's a licensed profession for taking care of the dead, and if you are not licensed and you are doing it for pay, you are going to put yourself in a position where you could end up in court, pay some pretty big fines, and have a misdemeanor charge. So
wow.
once we realized that, we went, okay, so we need to fully define what it means to work in this space, whether it's the before death space, the after death space, or any place in between, the celebrant space, people who are specializing in advanced directive work. So it was helped us become more granular about what this really meant to start a movement and to then gather people who could understand the fine-tuned part of this. On top of that, the doula movement sort of arrived after we'd been already doing this work for a good, a couple of decades or more. And there was a renewed interest in taking care of people before the death occurred. The reason that we started NEDA, the National End of Life Doula Alliance, was to further make that demarcation between before death care and after death care, because we didn't want a bunch of newbie doulas coming up going, wow, I'm going to do this. I love this. I'm
Yeah,
going to fabulous living at it. And we're going, and if you're not careful, you're going to lead to families losing the right to care for their own dead.
absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's been a big part of the experience for me.
Mhm.
I work with a lot of doulas who do incredible work, but they know the boundaries. And so I feel as though these two organizations working together in the early years really did some good work in establishing those boundaries and making sure that we're protecting doulas,
Yeah.
we're protecting the dead and dying, and we're protecting their families and friends.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
I love to hear kind of the evolution, right? You started
Yeah.
the Home Funeral Alliance. I'd love to hear how you got started. What was the problem specifically that you're trying to solve and what came to be? Or
It really was an interesting thing. It was one of those situations where things happened simultaneously, unconnected, but simultaneously in different places. We had Jerry Grace Lyons in Northern California, Donna Belk in Texas, Mary Lynn Rush in Michigan, Elizabeth Knox in Maryland. And they were all, oh, and Karen Van Buren in Colorado, really important. These were all people who were doing this work. And there were others, everybody being connected. And then suddenly there was this understanding, geez, if we're all doing this work and we're all trying to understand the law and convey it to students everybody was now trying to teach others. We need a national level organization that is going to be able to synthesize what needs to be understood by everyone, and
Absolutely.
then separate what things are specific depending on your location. And so that's how the NHFA was born. And it did a lot of really great work at the beginning there, getting everyone galvanized and educated.
Walk me through some of that red tape that you mentioned, right? So having a licensing professional, and did people come in as you grew this audience and brand equity, and then they're saying, "Oh," and then you receiving the slap on the hand, or how did you kind of
Oh,
also
no.
navigate through that?
Yeah, I mean, I arrived very quickly. The only reason I wasn't at the very beginning was because I was catching a baby on the West Coast at a llama farm.
What?
So,
What do you mean catching a
um,
baby in the lo—
I was there for my first granddaughter being born in
Oh,
a hot tub on a llama farm.
wow.
So, I flew right over the first meeting, and so I missed it at the beginning, but I was paying attention to what was going on. And, once I was able to get back to the NHFA right after that, I took one look at we did conferences, and attending one conference, it was very clear to me that everyone had great intentions and very little realistic organizational skill.
Right.
So, fortunately, I had that in spades. So I just translated that into helping shape the organization so that we knew how what we were doing and
Yeah.
why we were doing it and how we were going to move forward.
And let's talk a little bit deeper on that, right? So the whole concept of NHPA, National Home Funeral Alliance, is that families can be directing their own death, the dying, and that stage
Yes,
where no funeral home is required, right? And
exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm really curious, one is what's your background that kinda led you to lead this home funeral alliance, and what was it before you guys started this organization, and what has it been today, right? Like, I'm sure there's a huge transformation from
Yeah,
that.
well, my background was in hospice. I started that work in 1985 as a volunteer, and but my professional life was as a writer, and
Okay.
I worked in right, and a lot of that had to do with development in universities and colleges and nonprofits and so on.
Sounds like you're creative.
All of that, right,
Yeah.
and lots of graphic design work and all of that type of thing too. So that plus all the conservation work and the volunteer work that I had done in every community I lived in. So all of those skills just and more just translated into, okay, here's another nonprofit. Here's how we need to organize the nonprofit, but we also need to focus on how our members are going to sing from the same hymnal here. Make
Yeah.
sure everybody's got the facts. Let's make sure they are facts. And let's load those up and make sure that we're all together. And it was mostly women. It was mostly middle-aged white women. And so part of what we tried to do was expand that into other communities and see who else was
Yeah.
interested in this concept because of course we're dealing with religious, spiritual, cultural issues that are all different. So we weren't trying to find a one size fits all.
Yeah.
We were trying to just make sure everyone follows the letter of the law, nobody gets in trouble, and we find a way to inform the average person in this
Yeah.
country
And I'm
that
just so curious. They
they've
have—
always had the right to care for their own dead. They just didn't know it.
yeah, and okay, so I love to dive deeper into the legality of it all because there are some liabilities and rules I think that's been created. Because yesterday I spoke to a fourth generation funeral director, and he was telling me that his great grandfather back in the 20s, they were bringing in medicine bags and just embalming the body on a farm at
Sure.
someone's house in their living room. So that was how funeral was done. And curious if you're aware of how it translated into funeral homes, and then now there's this movement of, hey, you have the option of funeral homes, but you also have the option to do it from the comfort of your own home.
Right. Yeah, there's a really complicated history around the rise of the funeral industry here in the US.
Yeah.
And so
All
I'm
that little
probably gonna
history.
further than you wanna go, but I can tell you that it involves field embalming, it involves
Yeah.
presidents, and it involves zombies and lots of fun, interesting things. Things like, germ scares that caused people to
Mm,
believe that they couldn't handle caring for their own bodies anymore. But what part of what we were trying to do is bring back that understanding that you have that constitutional family law right here in the United States
mm,
for your own dead. Once you really understand that and you realize you have the authority and the agency and full custody and control, you can then relax and go, okay, what pieces and parts do I want to hire a professional for? Because that's more common than anything. We call it a blended funeral. But you have to start from the place where you understand that you can make decisions on your own. And then getting people comfortable with things that we've lost over time. I mean, it's in us. I always say to people, they're afraid of body care
mhm,
because, it's just been the body goes away, right? The phone call whisked away. Don't
mm,
know what happens there. When we keep someone home, we just bathe the body and keep it cool. That's all that's required. If,
mm,
depending on the cause of death, things are going to change. Again, that's why
mhm,
we have funeral directors. They're helpful. They're our friends. But if you have someone who's able to stay home and you can perform that yourself, a lot of people are nervous about it. And I just look at them and say, do you know how to operate a washcloth? And once they figure out, oh, it's this simple, particularly if they've been on hospice and the person has been home and they've been caring for them, it's a heck of a lot easier. I had one woman who had been caring for her mother for a good 25 years in her home, and her mother turned 100 either the day of or the day before she, uh, she died.
mm,
So she had died in the home. We'd been on the phone before, so we'd prepped what was going to happen. My job as an educator, it's not to do anything for anybody, it's to educate. So we had done that, and the death occurred and we had some issues getting through it because there were people who didn't understand what was going on. We had a hospice nurse that refused to leave the house until the funeral director came. And of course, this woman said, I am the funeral director. So we ended up with police involvement and a few other things. But about a week later, everything finally panned out. Everything worked fine. We got there. A week later, I called her on the phone. And I said, "Tell me what was the thing that really helped you the most about this whole thing?" And she said, "Oh, it was when you taught me how to cut her nightgown up the back and take it off and put another one on."
details, like
Right,
these type of things, that's what, a doula
right,
would kind of guide you on, right? Like,
right,
what you
right.
can do and what you can't do, and I think one additional thing is that because most states are relatively similar because of the STC rules, but, like, some municipalities do have their own inferences, and doulas can be that local specific expert and tell you, "Okay, well, you
Yes,
need a doctor plus a funeral director to get a death certificate, but maybe for the next city, it's something different." So that is absolutely another reason why you would want a doula, right? And by your side. And
right.
I did hear another story because oftentimes I think people ask why a home funeral, right? Why a home
Mm,
funeral?
mm.
What are some of the examples, which you just gave one, but I think a really, really cool story that I heard was unfortunately an infant passed away at home and they didn't want to bring it to, a funeral home right away. It just felt completely, detached from the situation. And I would love if you can share, any other particular story that goes for a home funeral where it makes sense and what you can versus cannot do.
Yeah, I think the infant question is really pertinent to the question you're asking. There is something more difficult, even more difficult, I think, from many people who've spoken to me about this and many cases I've been involved in, where hospice personnel were contacting me to say, the family wants to take, the stillborn home or fetuses, that they want to do that, and they're in some states are not allowed to. So I've had to be involved with those to try to work between the funeral director, what the family wants, what the hospital might have for a body release policy, and what the law is in that state. And I can tell you a couple of times, one in particular that sticks in my mind was when the hospital wouldn't change its rules about releasing the fetus to the mother and father. So we worked I worked to find, and this was in a state nowhere near me, but I
Wow.
had to find the funeral director who was willing to go into the hospital, get the material, the container, bring it out to the parking lot and hand it to the family. And those are the kinds of situations that are completely unnecessary. We have laws that were overthought or underthought or were simply written without actual people's rights in mind. So the best we can do as home funeral guides or as end of life doulas is to have a network of information and network of people that we can rely on when a situation like this occurs and we're running into even though it's an illegal, it's not compliant with the law, we still have to get in there and find a way to facilitate something that's going to meet the needs of the
Yeah,
and
100%. Wow.
and so it's a lot of work. I don't think people understand. They always have this idea that doulas are, as Lisa Carlson, by the way, who was the person who really started the home funeral movement and the Funeral Consumers Alliance. She said to me one time, "I don't like the idea that you're pulling all of these people, these women together for the National Home Funeral Alliance." She says it's just a bunch of paisley skirts and they're all out there doing this because, it makes them feel good about themselves. And I of course fought back with her about that for years. We had that conversation. But part of it was, yes, there's a vision that a lot of people are coming into doula work because they've suddenly had this epiphany that they're going to walk everybody home. Sorry, Ram Dass. And the fact is, that's not what doula work really is like. At
Yeah.
least it hasn't been in my life. I mean, in how many years since 85? How many years have I involved with hospice? I have sat bedside with one dying person who was not a family member, because it's not our job to take the power seat from the family
Yeah.
to be there first. Our job is to do the legwork, make
Yeah.
those phone calls, make those connections, set things in motion that are going to make things easier for the family, but the family stays in charge no matter whether
I
it's
love
before the
that.
death or after the death.
Yeah.
That was one of the in fact, that was a guiding reason for
Yeah.
why I agreed to help start the National End of Life Doula Alliance, because
I
I
think that's the best
want to see this
description that I've
through.
heard, yeah, on death
Yeah.
roll because it isn't, like, specific to any task, right? Sure, certainly it's non-medical, but, like, everything really is doula, touched, and yeah,
Mhm.
and I do wanna do a quick time check, so we have 4 minutes, and I wanna respect your time. I
Sure.
would love to actually film another episode just specifically on death doulas, but today
Mm.
we'll focus on the home funeral because there's just so much richness here. And I'm like, I can't get enough, and 4 minutes is definitely not enough. But what I want to
Good.
say here is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, right? I'm going to talk about what you can do for home funeral from my team's notes and what you cannot do. And what you can do is that you can designate a family member as the legal funeral director, which you called out, right? And
Well,
you
the law does that. Yeah.
the law, yeah. And it's also under your FTC rights that you can shop funeral homes, you know, based on itemized pricing. You can decline services if you don't want to. You can bring in your own casket. You can also transfer the body yourself, which in most states you can, but some requires a permit. That's something that I had no idea. You can also
Right.
file a
Right.
death certificate yourself. Again, varies by
Mhm.
state. You can also bury on private land. Also varies, right? Some rural states allow it, some don't.
Yeah, there's only 2 states that and a couple of counties like Bibb County in Georgia that doesn't allow it. But
Doesn't allow to be
here
buried on
yeah,
private land. Okay.
yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
and in most of those are you can get a permit and get do it anyway.
Yeah.
But back to your point, I mean,
Yeah.
there are an awful lot of things that the funeral rule, which was written to manage the funeral industry, definitely apply to practitioners, whether we are paid or not. But I mean, I wrote a whole book about this. It's all about, line by line, what things can we be paid for? And that's why as educators, we can be paid for an awful lot. Education includes demonstration.
Hmm.
It includes a lot of things. But what we have to understand is that when the person has stopped breathing, we are no longer death doulas. We can no longer charge money for
Oh,
before death
wow.
for death rates. We can have to charge for education that does not include
I had no idea.
hands-on body care. Okay, we cannot
Let's
be
let's
paid
let's save this nugget
right,
for next
all
one
that
because
kind of stuff.
wow, that's
Right.
that's so important because I don't maybe some doulas don't even know this,
Well,
there's
that's why we started NEDA, because we wanted people to understand that,
wow.
there are
Yeah, no idea.
there are hard stops for people. And again, going to the NEDA website, you're going to find a lot of this information. You'll find it in the essentials for home funeral guides in the after death care handbook.
Ooh,
And these are things, and of course, the work that I did in writing those books and getting those itemized lists of things
yeah.
you charge for and things you can't came directly from the Federal Trade Commission.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
yeah,
Let's dive deeper into that for
yeah.
Death Doula episode. Wow, this is so incredible. Thank you so much, Lee. I appreciate your knowledge and all the work that you poured in.